Welcome to BloomLiving. I am your host, Thomas DeSchutter, former rock musician turned financial strategist, sharing amazing ideas from amazing people looking to up the game of life whenever we can. Welcome. Welcome to today's show. Wow, we got a great guest coming up today. Today is the 13th episode of season 2 of the BloomLiving podcast. I am your host, Thomas DeSchutter, and it's a great pleasure to be on the air once again. One of the challenges that I really love about doing this show is the fact that we actually do a live show, and then we take this live feed and we feed that into the to the podcast site that we have, and then that gets distributed through podcast. But really, I was talking to somebody recently who has a show, and she's done a couple hundred. He's done a couple hundred shows, and she was sharing that she records a show, etc. And I did season 1 that way, where we recorded the show, and then I was able to edit and do that kind of thing. And what I find about the going live is there's no edit. It's like, this is it, man. We gotta nail it the first time around. And so it's really forced me to be present, to get myself right here, right now in this state, so that I can deliver something that hopefully has value for our listeners. And at the same time, when we bring our guests on, then it's really important that I'm present so that I can, guide the show along with them, ask great questions when the opportunity is there, and allow them to really serve and bring their light to the show. Because that's really, when we have a guest on, my feeling is this is about them. This is about making their presence felt and really feeding our audience with great gifts. Before I bring Andrew on, though, there's a couple of quick things I wanted to touch on. I've got a number of things I'm reading right now. One of them is Stealing Fire. And Stealing Fire has really opened up some ideas for me. And what I want to do here is just I'm not going to share the context of the book. I have in the past a little bit, but what I want to look at is the idea of stealing fire, and how can we, generate our lives, or where can we take things? And he gives these great examples in society of where we look to steal fire so that we can feed ourselves. One of the things, though, and there's a good side and a bad side to stealing fire. So for me, one of the bad sides to stealing fire is I've been on this kick lately about the idea of time and money, because he alludes to it in the book. And so for me, when I look at time and money, I'm thinking in the context of, everybody wants more time. One of the biggest searches on Google is time. How do I make more time? And so in our North American society, when I look at time and money, most of us spend our time generating financial stability, generating cash flow into our lives so that we can pay for whatever it is we've committed ourselves to paying, or so that we can just live a happy and fruitful life, spending money, enjoying ourselves. And so when I think of it in the context of stealing fire, I can't help but think that the more that we sign up for things that don't really serve our purpose, that don't feed our own true values, and we spend money on that, or we take on debt, we're really stealing our future. We're stealing our own time away from ourselves. And so here's what I mean by that. When you commit, let's just take a car, an automobile. Really, what do we need a car for? Basically to get from point A to point B. But in some cases, we have it like we need this amazing car, which is great. This is not a knock on how you spend your money. It's a thought. I'm having this experience about this thought, and I just want to share it and see if anybody else there is actually feeling the same way I am, or just share your ideas on it. So I look at it and I go, well, if I buy a $200,000 automobile, how much of my future time am I actually stealing from myself in order to pay for that? Because I'm either gonna, in my world, you pay for things only one of two ways. You either borrow the money from somebody else, or you take your own money and give up returns that you could earn for yourself. So no matter how you look at it, we're financing everything we do. Again, so let me repeat that. So we're financing everything we do. We're either borrowing from somebody else and paying them interest, or we're taking our own savings, our cash, our own opportunities to earn money on our money and giving that away when we pay with cash. So really, we're financing everything we do. And that ends up taking our time, because we live in a world where we need to create money and cash flow into our lives in which to live going forward. And so when I think of the context of stealing fire, and I then put it into my own life, and especially where I am right now, where, the journey that I'm currently on, I look and I go, wow, do I really need this? What is it I actually need my money to do for me? And I'm at a place where what I really want my money to do for me is earn me more money. That's really what I want it to do. I've got everything I pretty much need. And at the end of the day, what do I really need? I need some food, I need some simple housing, and I need some clothing and transportation in this world. Obviously there's some there's some joy and stuff there that I want to do with my family, of course. But at the end of the day, it's all about, spending time with the people I love. And so how much of my money can I dedicate to earning more money so that I can do more of that? I guess that's where I am today. And I know I'm going to ruminate on this a lot more, and I'm going to churn this around in my head. And down the road, I will come up with a thesis on this that I can really expand on and carve out some ideas in terms of how can we do that? How can we all win in a game of taking our time, our money, our energy, and creating more time for the things that we really want to do in life. I've got Andrew Allemann coming in. I think he's here with us now. Andrew, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. Yeah, you're great. So let me give you Andrew's quick bio. So the power of podcasting is today's show with special guest Andrew Allemann of podcastguests.com. Andrew Allemann is a niche media expert that has developed websites covering multiple industries. He is the founder of podcastguests.com, a service that connects podcasters with guests for their shows. Podcastguests.com has over 11,000 users. He is also the founder and editor of Domain Name Wire, a trade publication for the domain name industry that has been cited in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and NPR. Andrew, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here, and I liked I've been listening in the past 5 or 6 minutes, and that really resonates with me.
Yeah, thank you for that. And before we jump into the podcasting, I would love to know, have you set up? I had a guest on a couple episodes ago. We talked about multiple streams of income. Mm-hmm. It sounds like you have, just with the two, the podcastguest.com and the domain name wire, that's a couple of opportunities where you might be creating revenue. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I've always been one of those people that tries to spread things around a little bit. And so domain name wire has kind of been my bread and butter for a long time. It's an ad-supported model. Essentially, think of it an online blog for the domain name industry. And so it's a good, stable base of income. And then over 3 years ago, I started podcastguests.com, not knowing how I'd make money from it, but, saying, hey, let's build up something here and make money from that. And that's actually become quite substantial now too. So I'm fairly conservative when it comes to finances. So I like to have a few different balls in the air, if you will, so that if one starts to drop, the other one can pick that up. And both my wife and I are self-employed, so it's always good to have as much stability as you can possibly have when you're self-employed.
Yeah, I can relate to that. When I met my wife, Leslie, we were both in the entertainment industry working on film sets, and I was working on film sets part-time while being a recording musician in an original band. And I decided at that point, hey, I'd like to get married and have kids. I think one of us needs to do something that has a little more stability. So, fortunately I found
healthcare.
Yeah. So fortunately I found a passion in the finance industry, and that allowed me to move over into that. So tell me, I want to dig in a little bit on starting something like podcastguest.com, because you said something that's really really fascinates me, is you didn't know how you were going to make money from it, yet you went ahead and did it. Can you share a little bit, maybe like what that process was like, to trust that you were doing something that you didn't know how it was going to go, but you had this idea and you were driven to do it? And I'd love to dig into that a little bit.
Sure. So let me step back and explain kind of how the service came to be, and then I think it'll be easier to walk through some of those questions. So I've been podcasting for many years. In the first year of my podcast, it's related to domain names, the Domain Name Wire podcast, I was just tapping my own Rolodex to find guests for my show. And then after about a year, I was like, okay, that's 50 something guests. My Rolodex is running a little bit thin. I want to find new and interesting guests. And so I went out there to look for an easy way to find new guests for my show, and couldn't find any. There's some services out there that are essentially an agency model where they find people for you, but they're $500 plus a month. And I said, well, no one's really doing this out there. Let me create my own service. And so you ask about that, having faith in something where you don't really know how you're going to make money. I'd say that the key thing to how I set it up is I said, let me get this MVP, this minimum viable product out there without spending much money. So literally my initial outlays, you can set up a MailChimp account for free until you get to something like 2,000 subscribers to your email list. I used Google Forms, and I bought a domain name. I don't remember how much I paid. I bought it from someone else, but it wasn't too much, and set up a website, right? So this is under $1,000 to get this going. And I said, let me make this as simple as possible. So let me make this an email-based service in which each week I send out a list of podcasts that are looking for guests, and anyone who's on that email list can click a link and apply to be in those podcasts. And that link goes to Google Forms, which is completely free. So it was very minimal outlay at first. And I knew that my backstop was I could always, once I had enough people in this newsletter, I could always sell advertising. And that's kind of the model I'm familiar with. That's the model I use on Domain Name Wire. So I knew there was always something there if I could get it to be big enough. But there was still a little bit of a chicken and an egg problem, which is whenever you're creating what's effectively a marketplace where you have people on one side and another, so guests and podcasters, it's kind of hard to tell podcasters to use my service if I don't have guests ready to apply to be on their shows. And it's hard to get the guests to come on if they are like, well, where are the podcasts? So I really had to get in and really, you really just have to finesse that part, right? And it's get a couple hundred people on each side, just really sending out email, getting on the phone, whatever you have to do that. In the first week I sent it out, I only had like 200 guests using the service, getting the email. But I still, for some of the podcasts, I got 5 or 10 people applying to be on each show. And I was like, okay, I'm on to something here. And then I kind of built it up from there incrementally. Never, now I've invested tens of thousands of dollars into growing that list and other aspects of it. But I waited until it started to produce results before doing that.
Right. So you started with the MVP, the minimum viable product, and you just basically tested your theory like, hey, this might be a good idea. And at the end of the day, really, if nothing else happened, you at least had the ability to have some guests for your own show, right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that was the idea, right? That was the original idea. So that definitely, and then if it didn't work, I spent $1,000 and some time, so it's not the end of the world.
Right. And nice cup, by the way. For those out there in radio and podcast land. I
don't know if it's backwards here. It's I don't know if I set that up right, but
no, you got it right. It's okay. Correct. Podcast guests. Nice cup. So one of the things you touched on too that I'm going to jump on a limb a little bit here is I expect there was some hustle in the beginning. Is that right? On your part?
Hustle? Oh yeah. I mean, there was a lot of research out there trying to find podcasts and literally emailing the people, not spamming them, but sending individual emails to people about their podcast and how I'd like for them to join this service. One of the nice things, marketplace is difficult. But one of the nice things is a lot of podcasters also want to be guests on other shows. So in some ways you hit, two birds when you wants to other show as their best. It's completely free too, so that helped a lot in bringing in people to use it. I didn't have a monetization strategy at that point, so it's just, hey, let's bring in people. It's free. I can find out. I can go to a freemium model later on. And so that made it a little bit easier. But yeah, there was a lot of hustle, and that gets back to time that you're investing into something that you could be doing something else with. I'm very fortunate to not have to sell my time, if you will, as a, kind of the consulting model, X per hour, that sort of thing. So that made it a bit easier for me, but there was definitely a lot of hustle at the beginning.
Yeah, I think that's, for me, my experience at this point is anything worth doing, especially in the creative realm, because basically you were creating something that didn't really exist, and it's in a creative mindset. I mean, doing podcast shows and creating a show and having guests on is a very, creative field. And anytime, my experience, like when I think of back to being in a band, there was a lot of hustle. There was a lot of practice. There was a lot of rehearsal. There was a lot of, painfully writing songs and going out and playing to 10 people or 5 people in a bar on a Tuesday night when nobody was out, right? Like there was a lot of that stuff. Yet the benefits eventually came, right? By constantly working and hustling at it. Let's now focus a little bit on the whys. So why would somebody want to start a podcast? Where, I just kind of jumped into this for is like, hey, I want to do a podcast. I want to be creative again and do something creative, and just kind of, decided I would do it without I didn't really care how it turned out. I was doing it more for me in the beginning. But why would somebody now, because there's a lot of news out there now about podcasts, and especially long form can really be beneficial.
Yeah, so I kind of taking a step back from that. I think in today's society, in today's economy, it's important that everyone's an expert on something. So I think we're seeing job placement, job replacement. The world is changing. The economy is constantly changing. The one thing that you can do to add value to yourself, no matter what you do, if you work for someone else or if you work for yourself, is to be an expert in something. And that can be a big fish in a small pond. I write a trade publication for the domain name industry. It is not the world's biggest industry. Our conferences have maybe 1,000, 1,500 people tops. And so compared to some other ones where it's tens of thousands of people, but I'm an expert in something. So when people have a question on domain names, they know I'm an expert and they come to me. So I think that is one of the key things that everyone needs to do. Now, podcasts are a great opportunity to show your expertise in something. And so whether you are the host or the guest, it's an opportunity to share something, to teach something with people. And not only are you teaching them, but you're also building up your credibility as an expert at the same time. So why would someone listening today want to start their own podcast? I find that a lot of people start a podcast, they listen to a few that are very successful and bring in a lot of money from ad revenue. And they're like, oh, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to have hundreds of thousands of subscribers and downloads, and I'm going to sell ads. Well, the reality is the median number of downloads people get on their podcasts now are about 200. Only 200 people downloading that podcast to listen to it each week. And so you might be saying, well, obviously I can't sell ads against 200 people. That's probably not going to work. So I think there are a couple of reasons. One is to, again, continue to share your expertise and make yourself as an expert. The other thing is to think about that audience of, call it 200 people, as if you're standing here in front of an auditorium of 200 people. And if you could do that every week, that's actually pretty cool. Being able to speak to 200 people a week that are listening to you for a half hour or so. That's actually a pretty compelling argument. We're used to website analytics where you need tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of visitors. Podcasts are very different. The other thing I'd say, which to me is really the number one reason someone should start a podcast, if it's depending on what the topic is, but let's say they're in business, is the opportunity to chat one-on-one with people that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. And so on my podcast, I have a lot of CEOs of publicly traded companies on the podcast, or people that are really, really big thought leaders in their space. And if I were to call them up and say, hey, I'd love to chat with you for a half an hour just to learn from you, they'd blow me off, right? But if I say, hey, I'd like for you to be a guest on my podcast, I'd like to introduce you to my audience, then all of a sudden they're like, ooh, I'm getting something out of this, right? There's actually value to them. And so you'll be amazed at who you can chat with for a half hour as long as it's in a podcast setting. And so I think that's a key reason that people should consider setting up a podcast. And then from the creative side, as someone who's been blogging for over 15 years, I love the idea of sharing content and having people consume it and having people learn from it. So I just get a lot of personal satisfaction from that.
The share word. Huh?
Yes.
Yeah. It's funny how in today's, and thank you for that, by the way, that was really great. A couple of things that came up for me. One is I have benefited greatly personally from having a podcast. The people that I've been able to sit down with and talk, either, one-on-one is, face-to-face is beautiful because you can really connect with a person. This medium is also great because, I'm able to, in this example alone, I'm able to pick your brain, grab your years of experience and share it out there. But also I learn from that as well. I learned from that experience. I can now talk to somebody at a deeper level about why they might want to do podcasting, or, as we dive in a little bit here, some pitfalls they might want to avoid, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So your point is well taken. Like for me as a human, I've evolved just by having my guests come on and really share their expertise with me. So thank you. So speaking of pitfalls, what 5, because you've highlighted some things that you've done some research on. So 5 mistakes new podcasters make.
Let me run through just a couple of those, and putting myself back in the seat of when I started a podcast, some of the mistakes I made. And so one of them is really an overarching one, is trying to be too perfect. Okay. And so perfection oftentimes gets in the way of just kind of getting your foot out in front of you and starting something. And I tried too hard before I started my podcast. And so there are a few things you have to do before you start a podcast. One is you have to get a decent microphone setup. And so I can see from where you are, you have a nice setup. I'm actually in a temporary setup right now. So, we just moved and our studio isn't set up. We've got some sound dampening that you probably see behind me, but my good mic isn't set up. I'm speaking through a $50 microphone, a snowball microphone, and that sort of thing. But I spent so much time researching and trying to figure out the best way to start my podcast. So I felt like I needed to hire someone to do a voiceover introduction for my podcast. And I had to have the best equipment to start. And as a result, it took a few months to really get going. And I ended up ditching that voiceover I had and just doing my own introduction with music, that sort of thing. And I really wasted a lot of time trying to get going there. I think there are a few things that podcasters need to do before they get started. One is to have a decent microphone. And by decent, I mean, so this right here is a $50 snowball microphone you can get on Amazon. I would say this is kind of your minimum intro to get a decent sound quality. The other thing you need to do is to find a quiet room to do it in. And you don't have to buy sound dampening equipment or anything like that. My wife, whose podcast is very successful, much more successful than mine, started hers recording in our walk-in clothing closet because it dampens all the sound. It gets rid of the echo. It's a great little hack to get started. It doesn't work if you're doing visual like this, but if you're just doing an audio podcast, which most of them are, it's a great little hack. It doesn't cost anything. The other thing you need to do, and this is a mistake that a lot of podcasts make, is that they go through and they have horrible cover art. They either go to Fiverr and spend $5-10 getting some cover art made, or they make it themselves. And if you go into any podcast app looking at podcasts, people do judge a book by its cover, right? You know, you never put out a new book and just have a horrible cover. Same thing goes for a podcast. And so I recommend people spending a bit of money here. You can always change your cover art later, but you can get a really good cover art made for $200-300 that will really stand out to you. And in fact, when I put together my weekly newsletter, a podcast, if someone has a really bad cover art, I tend to push them down a little bit in the list and put someone with good cover art, because it reflects negatively on me, on my newsletter. It doesn't look good. So that's another key thing that I think people should do there.
Awesome. Thank you. So it's kind of like put your best foot forward whenever you can.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you know, I see so many people that are like, oh, I read somewhere that I need to release 10 podcasts at once. So I'm getting all these podcasts in the can. And it's like, just get it out there. Just, you know, get 2 or 3 out there to launch, get them out there, submit them. At that point, you can submit them to Apple Podcasts and all these other services. And then you can always improve it along the way. And I think a lot of us are perfectionists and we want to be perfect, but that can really impede your progress on doing something that could be life-changing for you.
Right. That's great. You know, so here's, as a musician, I kind of had a bit of an unfair advantage in that for me, the you know, the idea of throwing together a microphone and plugging it in, and, you know, as I say jokingly, I've never met a microphone I didn't like, that it was really simple, right? So I just kind of went into it like, hey, I can do a podcast. I mean, what does it take? GarageBand's pretty simple to understand. And, you know, away I went. I actually bought I probably spent way more money than I needed to. I bought a Zoom H6 multi-track unit so that I could sit one-on-one with 2 microphones across from somebody. They would have their own, and I was using Shure SM58 microphones. So they would have their microphone, I'd have mine, and we would have a conversation back and forth. And then as I did a Voice America show for 13 weeks, which forced me into the live world of actually going live on radio. So that's when I, you know, bought this setup. And because they offered the ability to use Zoom is when I connected Zoom and upped that game. And then when in the live world, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so stressful. You know, the first show that I went to do live, I was just like panicked. Like, you know, how's it going to go? What if I say the wrong thing? What if I don't know what next question to ask and it's dead air? Like all of these things went through my head. Turned out fine. And now, you know, and now we're here. What's your wife's show?
So hers is the Internet of Things podcast, and you can just go to iotpodcast.com to find places to download that. And so that's downloaded well over 100,000 times a month.
Wow.
So, which is pretty good for a podcast technology. Again, the median is just a couple hundred. And so I help her as well on that podcast on monetizing it effectively.
Right. Beautiful. So that's like another stream of income. So now we're in the household. Now we're up to.
It's a household stream of income, right?
Yeah.
So that was, that's something that I spend a little bit of time on, but that's mostly her thing, right?
Right.
So if one of our industries crashes, probably all 3 won't at the same time, right? So.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if the guest I had on had 5 a couple of weeks ago. Rich Redmond, who's a drummer, okay. He has 5 streams of income that he uses through the music world and outside of the music world, and that's his reasoning, right? If one of them or 2 of them go away, he still has, you know, something that can at least pay the bills.
Yeah, I do think there are challenges to that, though, and I think one of the biggest challenges I run into is moving my mind from podcasts to domain names to the Internet of Things to it's a lot of different moving parts, and you need to be able to compartmentalize. And you know, fortunately, there are a lot of tools out there now that make it easier. I mean, Gmail allows you to pull in all these different email addresses. You can tag them with what business it's related to, right? So I pull in my podcast guest email address, my domain name wire email address, and they have a lot of nice features that make it easier now. So if I'm if I block off 2 hours just to work on podcast guests, I can easily find all the emails related to that. I can snooze anything that's not related to it and really block that out. But it is challenging. And oftentimes you're talking about multiple sets of books too, from a finance perspective, which I know scares a lot of people. But I have a degree in finance, geek out part of it. I know like that, which really gets to another point with sourcing and using experts. I'm a big fan of using people that are experts in their field, right? And so I don't mix my own audio. I don't edit it. I outsource that to someone for under $500 a month. They just take care of all of it. I just say it's done, and they go take care of it. They upload it to my host. They edit it. They make me sound better than I really am. I don't do live like this, so I can't cheat here. But they take care of all of that, because that was one of the things I tried to do before starting my podcast. I spent a lot of hours trying to figure out how to use Audacity to edit, and it was so frustrating. And then I realized it made a lot more sense to have someone who does this all day, every day, do it, and just outsource that part. We run across that in the domain name business all the time. People will hire lawyers that don't know anything about domain names to handle domain name disputes, and they end up messing up, and so you hire a specialist domain name lawyer if you have a domain name issue. You don't go to, someone who specializes in family law, that sort of thing. And so I'm a big fan on outsourcing to the experts in that particular field.
Yeah. You bring up that's a great piece. Thank you for that, Andrew, because one of the things I've learned in the 20 years that I've been in managing personal finance and entrepreneurs' finance is that I don't even want to really manage portfolios anymore. I've outsourced that to people that love to sit and watch the market all day long. Like, they can't wait to uncover the next greatest strategy in portfolio building. That's not me. I'm big picture. I want to sit down with a family or an entrepreneur and go, where are we trying to get to?
Mm-hmm.
Let's start putting the pieces in place that, bring in the experts in accounting. If we need legal, bring in an expert business lawyer. If we need portfolio management, bring in a professional portfolio manager and have them do their job. But let's have you and I work on exactly what it is we want to capture going forward, and then plug those pieces in that are the experts. So that's really, and I do that, mostly with my business as well. I don't do my bookkeeping. I'm terrible.
Right.
Yeah,
outsource the things that don't provide the best value to you or that you don't enjoy, for sure.
Yeah. Now, question about guests, about being a guest, because it's something Leslie and I have talked about, Leslie being my business partner and my spouse. We've talked about getting me out there on more shows,
right?
Because I am an expert in the financial field, and I want to highlight that more and more going forward. So, what are some of the benefits of being a guest on a podcast? And of course, your service offers the ability for that. But what are some great ways to get on shows?
Right. And so I guess we kind of put the cart before the horse earlier too, talking about starting your own podcast. But before you even start your own podcast, try to be a guest on some podcasts first. I mean, it's a fantastic way to get your feet wet. And it's easier to be a guest than to be the host who has to take care of all the technical issues and the interviewing and that sort of thing. So I would recommend anyone that's thinking about starting a podcast to first be a guest on some. And so I put together a free guide that makes it super simple to kind of get started. You don't even have to enter your email. I'm not trying to, sell you anything, but if you go to podcastguest.com/guide, you can download this guide, and it walks you through. I'll just give kind of some highlights on it, looking at this right now, but on the process of doing this. And so the first thing you want to do before you say, okay, I want to be a guest on some podcasts, and you could have a lot of motivations for this. You might just want to share. You might want to get your name out there. And in your case, Thomas, it's, if you're a guest on other podcasts, those are by definition podcast listeners. And so you can grow your own audience. The number one way to grow your own audience as a podcaster is to be a guest on other podcasts. And people listen to you and are like, hey, that's interesting. I want to learn more. And then they start listening to your podcast. So you want to put the best you forward. And the way to do that is to put together what the industry calls a one sheet. Sometimes you'll hear it called a one pager. And this is essentially a sales pitch about you. So usually you'll have your picture up there. You'll have what your expertise is and some credibility type things like, you were quoted in Wall Street Journal or something like that. Some of the things that you mentioned at the beginning of the show about me. So that gives you credibility. Well, if the Wall Street Journal, NPR, Washington Post, that sort of thing quotes you, okay, this person's probably pretty good. And so you're really selling yourself. It's a resume, but it's designed to pitch yourself to be on podcasts. People want to know that the person coming on the podcast is prepared. And so the more effort you put into this one sheet, the better. A lot of people create these as a PDF, which is fine. Although in today's day and age, I don't know if you're ever on your phone trying to find a restaurant and a PDF menu pops up. It's frustrating. You're sitting here pinching and zooming. A lot of people do their business on mobile phones now, so I wouldn't necessarily do it as a PDF. I would do something online, and that's one of the things Podcast Guest offers. Comes with a monthly fee, but you can do it on your own too. You can create a simple web page that you can send to people. So that would be kind of where I would start if you want to be a guest on the podcast. And then the next step is to find and pitch those podcasts. And this is very much something like the PR world, where it's a numbers game, right? You have to reach out to a lot of podcasts. You have to pitch them, explain why you would make an interesting guest. And so in this case, if you've listened to one or two of their podcasts, it makes it a lot easier. You can say, oh, I noticed you guys chatted about this. I have a different take on it. Or, I've spent 10 years helping families with their own finances, and I've come up with 5 mistakes that I find to be very common. So that's one way to do it, pitching. And then I think you'll find that once you get on a few podcasts, people start coming to you and invite you to be on their show, depending on how successful and popular that podcast is. But then that's where podcastguest.com can come in, especially if you're just starting out. You can sign up for the newsletter at podcastguest.com. That's completely free. And each week, right now, I highlight 7 podcasts that are looking for guests. And there's a wide variety. So this past week, I think I had a Dallas sports podcast. So that's fairly small. The qualifications are very narrow there. But then I have business podcasts, people that want to interview people that started their own business or their own side hustle, or someone looking for financial experts, that sort of thing. And if you meet those qualifications, you just click a link, fill out a short application, and you need to spend some time on that application to really pitch yourself to that person, but then hopefully you get invited onto shows that way. So those are the first couple of steps. I talked a little bit earlier about sound quality. And so one of the key things to understand here is that people don't expect you to have a perfect audio setup, but you want to get the expectations ahead of time. And I think this is something that podcasters fall down on the job on a lot. I always tell people before they're on my podcast, you need to wear a headset of some sort, even if it's just earbuds. So I'm not using these for my voice. I'm using this separate microphone for my voice, but I want to prevent any echo coming in. And the setup we have here, there's probably not going to be an echo. But on Skype, a lot of times, if someone's talking into their microphone laptop and then the voice is coming out, then the microphone picks it up and you get this kind of feedback loop, which is bad. So kind of setting those expectations, both as a podcaster and as a guest, on what the audio setup should be. Again, go invest $50 in a snowball microphone at a minimum. It's not that much money, but your voice will sound much better. And it works. That's what I'm speaking into now. It's not my preferred microphone. I just haven't had a chance to set it up here yet, having just moved. But I think those are kind of your beginning points as far as preparing. I mean, I think every podcaster has had a situation where they interview someone who is at the airport. And it's like, you have all this background noise. You're like, wait, what are you doing? And they just don't know because they haven't been on podcasts before. And so as a guest, it's important to think about, what noises are going to be around me? How can I dampen those as best I can? Maybe it's sitting in my walk-in closet with all the clothes around it for a half hour to do the interview. But there are lots of things you can do there. And then I'd say the other thing as a guest is to follow up afterwards. So just recording a podcast is one thing, but then you want to promote that podcast. And that's one of the things you can sell to podcasters as well. So one of the things I tell people that interview me is my one sheet says what I'll do to promote their podcast. And in fact, every one sheet on my system has the same thing, which is how that person will promote their podcast. So once this is turned into a recording, I'll include it in my newsletter, which goes out now to close to 13,000 people. And that helps you out, right, as a podcaster. And so that's one of the ways to grab people's attention. If you have a good audience already, that's a good way to convince people to have you as a guest on their podcast.
Yeah, that's nice. That's a good piece. The closet story, it's because you've mentioned it twice, ending up in a clothes closet. I was doing, so when I started, I was always going to be face-to-face, one-on-one, so that I could control the environment a lot more. And as I've, grown with guests, that doesn't make sense. I'm not sure where you're located, Andrew.
Yeah, right now I'm in Seattle. 3 weeks ago, I lived in Austin. So yeah, that would be pretty, difficult. So
yeah, we're not that far because I'm in Vancouver, or pretty much. So I'm just north of you. But yeah, I'm not going to drive down to Seattle to do the show, right?
Right.
But I was doing a show. I had this great space where we would record the show at my old office, and we were recording the show, and a tree pruning service set up shop out back, and all of a sudden it's like. And I'm like, being a musician and a guy who's recorded in studios, immediately I can't even focus on my guest. I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got to get out of here. Like, we actually ended up in a closet, the two of us with no light. There's no light in this closet. The two of us sitting in the dark with our handheld mics doing the show. We were laughing about it, but it was awesome. It was a great experience.
Yeah.
Couple quick things before we wrap up, and you've given us such great information, Andrew. I really appreciate what you've brought to the show today.
My pleasure.
Some of this stuff I certainly wish I had known off the top, and also I love to learn as I go. So it's been great. There's no regrets. Why would someone join podcastguest.com? Like, what are the real benefits that they're going to see from that?
Sure. So podcastguest.com makes it very, very easy to find podcasts to get booked on as a guest, and it helps podcasters find guests. And so let's take the situation where you want to be a guest on other podcasts. You sign up. It's free. I send that weekly newsletter every week with a list of podcasts. You scan through it, look for ones that are a fit for you. And if you are a fit, you apply, and then they can reach out to you. So that takes out the whole researching podcasts to be on, finding their email address and reaching out to them, right? It's very simple to do that. And then likewise for podcasters, again, it's free. They submit their podcast. It takes a while for me to feature them in the newsletter. I have a long backlog, but once they're in there, depending on the topic, they can get 50 to even sometimes over 100 people applying to be on their show, which is, they don't invite everyone on, but that's, as a podcaster, that's extremely valuable. And it depends a lot on the topic. Obviously, that Dallas sports podcast isn't going to get that many responses, but, a general business one or entrepreneurship one or even a general sports one can get a lot. I do obviously make money from the service now beyond just that advertising model, which I had in the back of my mind. So what I did there is I said, okay, I have a lot of these people, a lot of experts that want to get booked on podcasts, but there's still some elbow grease they have to put into it, right? They have to search through or review the list every week. They have to fill out these applications. They might not hear back. So I said, why don't I flip the tables here and say, hey, podcasters, why don't you create an online one sheet on podcastguest.com that'll be part of a directory. And then I might have misspoken. Hey, guests or experts can do this. And then the podcasters come into the directory and they look for people. So let's say I'm looking for people with a finance background. I can go to the finance category and find all sorts of experts. You know, I have one person on there who's an expert in self-directed IRAs, which are a neat kind of thing that I think a lot of people look at as they go through life, is not just investing in the stock market, but other things. So, hey, that might be a great guest for my finance podcast. And then the podcaster here invites the guest on. And so it kind of becomes a push and a pull. I always encourage people to look through the weekly newsletter and apply to shows, but then you can also have your listing in the directory and then get invited to be on podcasts. And one of the things I do there are a couple different levels. It's still very cheap. It's $29. Level. I feature experts in there on a rotating. So if you actually get the newsletter, you'll also see that I have 7 or so experts in there as well. And so what happens is podcasters are going through and are like, oh, that person make a great guest for my show. I didn't notice them in the directory, or maybe they're new, and invite them on to the podcast as well. So I have a few hundred people who pay that monthly fee to get that extra level of service, to have people invite them on shows. And then the rest, the vast majority, are just using the free service, which is great as well. And that's where I recommend everyone starting. Try it out, get your feet wet, see some results from it. I hear from people all the time who say they've been booked on a dozen or more podcasts through the service. And a lot of those people are using the free service. They're just putting extra work into it compared to the people that pay. Right.
And so they just go to podcastguest.com, and it's pretty simple to register, right?
Right. Yeah. And it's podcastguests.com, plural. I know you just said that, but just to be clear. And all you have to do is enter your email address. Put your email address, your name in there, and you're signed up. And what's happening there is you're being added to a MailChimp mailing list, which is no longer free at this point with 13,000 people on it, but it's really easy, and you can try it out. If you don't like it, you unsubscribe. It's as simple as that. I'll never bother you again. But I think most people get a lot of value out of the service.
That sounds great. One thing I want to touch on a little bit before we sign off is the marketing your podcast, maybe like sharing it, just like sharing it on social media. Do you have sort of a best practices around that? Or, do you share to all of them or focus on one or two? Maybe talk a little bit about your experience around that.
So I'm fortunate to have an audience in my blog that's related to my individual podcast. And so I post my podcast to the blog, and that helps. And then I have the blog set up to automatically push those out to all my social media channels. So that's, for me, the big one is Twitter, but then also LinkedIn and Facebook to an extent as well. On Twitter, I have like 35,000 followers, whereas on Facebook, it's much smaller. LinkedIn is great because of the audience. It's very business specific. So if your podcast is related to business, for sure. I know some people, for them, it's Instagram, right? Just not for me. So think about what your top social channels are. And the other thing here to do is to make sure that your guests are promoting it. And you can get fairly aggressive here because, again, hopefully you've talked about how they're going to promote it ahead of time. But for example, if a few weeks from now, after you've published this as a podcast, I haven't included it in my newsletter, you should reach out and say, hey, any chance you can feature this in a newsletter like we talked about? And then, just kind of those reminders. You have to nudge people, and sometimes even creating a canned social media post so it's just really easy for them, or tagging that guest in your social media, which depending on the platform will show up to their audience already, but then they can just retweet, they can share, they can do that sort of thing to make it even easier for them.
That's great. Yeah, that's something Leslie and I have talked about. We haven't been so thorough on understanding. And even, I like what you said about even off the top is just, Leslie actually pulled in an application the other day for me to be on a show. And that was one of the questions to qualify to be on the show was, how are you going to promote this show to your audience? And I thought, oh, that's something we don't do. Like, we've never asked that question of anybody. And I think it's really great because at the same time, as much as I love giving this service, I do want to grow the show. Like, right. I want nothing more than this episode with you, Andrew, to be heard by a lot of people that are interested in podcasting and getting a jump on it. Like, I really want to have them have something that they can tune into and go, oh, here's some really great pieces that you've shared. I now understand what I need to do to actually launch a podcast. So I think that's really great.
Yeah. And I mean, when you think about it here, so when I include this in the newsletter, it's podcasters, people that are starting, want to be a podcaster, that sort of thing. So they should be interested in listening to it. And then they'll listen to your intro there, which you chatted about before I came on, about your thinkings here around working for things and debts and those sorts of things. And they might say, oh, this is interesting. Let me check this person out. And then hopefully they subscribe to your podcast. And so there's no easy way to promote podcasts. And that's one of the things, that's why so many podcasters give up. It's not as easy as Google just discovering your content. And although it's getting a little bit better, I mean, Apple Podcasts, there's no way to search deep into episodes of podcasts or their service. So, if someone wants to, your title of your podcast, which is essentially what they've been searching off of for so many years, has nothing to do with podcasts, how to be a podcast expert, right? So it's very difficult to get discovered on even these podcast platforms. And fortunately, there are some competitors coming into the space now that are making that better, but there's not really AdWords for podcasts. When you start a website, you might do some Google ads, that sort of thing. There's nothing like that for podcasts. So there are some challenges there. To date, the best way I think most people have found to grow their audience is to do exactly what we're doing here. Hopefully some of your audience signs up for my service or listens to my podcast. And then, hopefully I'm able to help you grow your audience as well.
Yeah, beautiful. Well said. Any last thing before we sign off, Andrew, that you don't think we covered or that you think is hugely valuable?
Well, you're a great interviewer, so I think we covered a lot of stuff. I would just say, put a step forward. If this is something that interests you, go out there, investigate, listen to a few podcasts. If you don't listen to a bunch right now, go investigate some in your topic of expertise. Just do something to take the next step on something that could end up being a big part of either your career or even hobby going forward.
That was fantastic. Just do something.
Right. We'll steal from Nike here. Just get out there, do something.
Well, so much of creating your life is the ability to just take another step. Mm-hmm. And I have a really good friend in Tennessee, Chattanooga. He's a vitalistic chiropractor. He shared a post the other day on Instagram, which was in the vein of just do something, was also, though, when it's the hardest thing to do in that moment is when you're going to get the most reward, right? So for me, the example would be yesterday, I really did not feel like going for my morning run, right? And I don't run like, I'm not talking 10 miles here. I run about, 2 miles, 2.5 miles, and maybe 3 times a week, but I really didn't feel like it yesterday, but I did it because I heard his little voice in my head. And when I got back though, I felt really great. Like way better than most runs because I fought through that resistance, right? Like I actually gained some confidence in myself, some soul searching, if you will, by pushing myself through that boundary.
Right. Excellent.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Andrew. We will be hosting this or putting this up by the end of the week. We'll certainly let you know it's up, and we'll be sharing it through our social media channels for sure. And we'll, of course, ask you to do the same.
I'll do the
same. As you alluded to. And I'm going to sign up for your service. Just so you know, I'm actually going to sign up for your service. I think what you're offering is fantastic, and I want to see how I can leverage it for myself, and I may become one of your paid subscribers as well. So
and that's, I should say that's how your wife, or how Leslie found me on this was through my one sheet on there. So it works.
There you go. That's fantastic. And I guess the best way to get in touch with you is through the website. Is that right?
Yeah, you can just go to podcastguests.com. You can also email me. It's just andrew@podcastguests.com, and I read and personally respond to all of you.
Awesome. Thank you. You've been absolutely wonderful with your information today. I really appreciate. And Andrew, I look forward to speaking to you again in the future.
Thank you so much. My pleasure, Thomas.
Thank you.
A huge thanks to today's guest and to you for being a part of the show. Now, if any of the ideas or stories did strike a chord with you, then I'd be honored if you would just take a quick moment to do a couple of things. One, if something in particular did resonate with you and you feel like it would make a difference in the lives of others, then please go ahead and share this through your social media channels. We'd like that very much. And two, if you are feeling compelled to join in on our ever-growing Bloom Living conversation, then hit the subscribe button and we'll show up every time there is a new episode available. You know, it's not only my goal, but it's the goal of our entire Bloom Living team and community to be the very change that we want to see in the world. All ideas begin with a conversation, first with yourself and then with others. So we welcome your voice and we ask that you send along any comments, thoughts, or questions. This is Thomas DeSchutter, Bloom Living.
I don't wanna turn your stomach fast. I don't wanna get all mired in track sentiment. But I think I found me a pocket here. There's pipe bombs floating on my television. My mailbox of bankers warning. Down my street, a drive-by shooting.